Hi everyone, and thanks very much for coming out today. My name is Brendan, and I'm the co-chair with Doug Brown of the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, one of the sponsoring organizations. We'll get to that in just a moment. Thanks for coming out tonight. We have a fully packed house, and we've had to bring out the extra chairs. Dan's book is interesting on its own, but now we have the situation of the U.S. involvement in Venezuela's election and political process, and that's just added more incentive to come out because Dan is one of the foremost commentators on Venezuela and Latin American affairs in the United States. So before we start, I just wanted to recognize that this meeting is being held on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee and Mississauga peoples. We are treaty peoples subject to various treaties, and we thank the Native peoples for the opportunity to hold this meeting here today. And we also thank the New Vision United Church and Reverend Ian Sloan for making this facility available for tonight's event and so many other nights. So thank you, Ian. Also wanted to recognize local dignitaries in attendance, Darren Green, the chair of the Steelworkers Area Council. And we have Anthony Tamburino from the Labor Studies Certificate Program. So thanks for coming out, gentlemen. There is a sign-up sheet that is going to be circulated during Dan's address on behalf of the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War. I think Gerard has it. Yep, there it is, Jerry. So that's the sign-up sheet if you want to get on the email list, if you want to learn about future and upcoming events of this nature. This meeting, as I said, is being sponsored by the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War and the Canadian Peace Congress. You can find out more. The Canadian Peace Congress has chapters in Canada, including in Toronto, and there's activity happening there, and you can learn more about the coalition through the Unusual Sources radio program and podcast and the Facebook page and Twitter account and website, which is hcsw.ca. And the speaker from the Canadian Peace Congress will follow Dan's lecture, and Dan will be able to sign copies of his book as well following the Q&A. So the reason we're here, let me introduce our speaker, Dan Kovalik. It's really fortuitous that Dan is here to speak today. As well as being a labor lawyer and a professor, Dan is a veteran solidarity activist with all the struggles for liberation in South America and Latin America, Nicaragua, Honduras, Cuba, and now Venezuela. Wherever the United States has interfered, Dan has stood up in solidarity for their right to self-determination. Just as he stands up for labor, for Palestinians, and all those oppressed by a world order of greed and exploitation. I've been following Dan for more than 10 years. He was a consistent voice against the U.S. aggression in Iraq. The whole time on this war on terror, he's shown the links between what's happening in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the desire among U.S. elites to retain control of a global profit-driven system. And when it came time to defend Libya and Syria, Dan stood up while so many shrank from their responsibilities as leftists or peace activists. Dan understands the empire in a comprehensive fashion. He understands we're dealing with a system of domination. And it's that systematic approach he brings to his new book, The U.S. Plot to Control the World. Just as he did in his other books, The Plot to Scapegoat Russia from 2017, and The Plot to Attack Iran from 2018. So with that in mind, I'm pleased to present to you Dan Kovalik, one of the most prominent voices against imperialism in our hemisphere.
I just wanted to announce that we have refreshments, and you can feel free at any time to help yourself.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for that incredible introduction. And thanks for coming out tonight on a very cold night on Family Day, a holiday I just learned about. It's President's Day back in the U.S. I think this is a holiday I could get around, not as much as the other. So it's a good time to be north of the border. But isn't it always? I wanted to start with a quote that I saw a couple days ago. It was from Off Guardian, which is the op-ed section, online op-ed section of the Guardian newspaper. And here's the author says, "I understand the need to act in Venezuela. The country has seen weeks of violent protests. The embattled president has less than a 17% approval rating, and government forces have been gassing and maiming civilians on the streets. Oh, sorry, that's not Venezuela, that's France. And indeed it is France. And I think this illustrates, really the double standard that is behind this bad religion that I call it, known as humanitarian interventionism, which is really the flavor of the month. Sadly, it's been so for a long time, certainly since the 90s. And it's this idea that the best we can do for the world here in the West, in Canada, and the U.S. is to figure out where we can use our military power to forward human rights and democracy, as opposed to trying to figure out where we need to leave and refrain from intervening in to protect human rights and democracy. And this is something that it took a while for me to really focus on. But again, there's a double standard involved, which I'd like to illustrate with this following question. Please, could I just see a show of hands? Who has ever heard of the Tiananmen Square massacre? Alrighty, in China, 1989. There were protests there, many by students, and a number of people were gunned down by the military. It's not certain how many. There's a wide-ranging estimate of somewhere between 300 and 3,000 people who were killed in 1989. This is a huge event. Everyone knows about it. Everyone raised their hand. There was a 25th anniversary commemoration of it. This is a big deal. Now let me ask you, who in the room here has heard about the Caracazo?
Caracazo?
Yes, Caracazo, yes. How many? You must have, right? No? I see one hand. One hand. In the Caracazo in Venezuela, took place in 1989. There were protests, kind of similar to what's happening in France now. It was the straw that broke the camel's back for the people, particularly the poor, was a rise in oil prices that affected their standard of living. And so people rose up in protest, and there was a very heavy-handed military reaction to these protests. It's estimated between 300 and 3,000 people were killed. And yet you've never heard of it. There was no 25th anniversary commemoration of it. It is a non-event for most people here. Now the interesting thing is, of course, so the range of people killed is about the same in China and Venezuela in these two events, both of which took place in 1989. But of course, China at the time had about 1 billion people. Venezuela had less than 30 million people. So 300 to 3,000 people killed in Venezuela proportionally is a much more catastrophic event, right? Moreover, what changed in China because of the Tiananmen Square massacre? Nothing. The protests were put down and the government went on virtually the way it had. What happened in Venezuela? Hugo Chavez happened. It was this event in 1989 which led to the rise of the movement that 10 years later would put Hugo Chavez into power as president. Because people decided that they could not handle that repression anymore, and they also decided that they were tired of being poor and tired of a country that was so economically unfair and disparate. So again, if you look at the two events, the Venezuela event is much more historically significant. And yet we don't know about it. We don't learn about it. And why? Because the people who carried out that massacre were friends of the United States and Canada. This was a government friendly with us. We were happy that those people were put down because we were benefiting from the oil of Venezuela. And when Chavez was elected, he he was elected on a platform to use the oil of Venezuela for his own people. Something that we have a hard time tolerating. So this gets into this notion that these two different events, France and Venezuela, China and Venezuela, into something that Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman wrote about a long time ago, this idea of worthy and unworthy victims. So a worthy victim, in quotes, or victims, are people who are repressed, killed, tortured, etc. by countries we don't like China, okay? So if China does something to someone, those are worthy victims, and we learn about them almost every day, right? However, if a government like the US itself or Canada or its allies does something to others, represses them, tortures them, kills them, this is an inconvenient fact that we largely are not made aware of, right? And so what happens, the way the propaganda structure works, and we're seeing it played out now with Venezuela, is one, you get if there is a government that we don't like that's marked, particularly in this case for regime change, which Venezuela is, we will hear about Venezuela nearly every day in the news, to the exclusion of every other country in the region. And we will hear a one-sided view of what's happening in that country. We will hear from those who don't like the government. We will never hear from those who like the government. Even though, and I was an election observer in May of last year, even though Nicolas Maduro, in elections, which, by the way, had been respected for years, Jimmy Carter called the Venezuela electoral system the very best in the world. In an election carried out in the same way that Carter witnessed and how I witnessed, Nicolas Maduro was elected president with 67% of the vote, over 6 million votes cast for him. Yet when was the last time you heard one person, one out of those 6 million people, in the newspaper or on TV? You never do. So you get an obsessive coverage of this country, and you get a one-sided view, and so you're led to believe that this country, in this case Venezuela, is somehow a uniquely troubled, if not evil, in the hemisphere that needs to be dealt with, possibly by military force, which is being threatened right now. Meanwhile, next door is a country called Colombia, which you almost never hear about. Colombia, you might be surprised to learn, has more internally displaced people than any country on earth, even more than Syria, at over 7 million internally displaced people. Disproportionately, they are Afro-Colombians and indigenous peoples who've been moved off their land by pro-state forces, including paramilitary death squads, acting on behalf of international and national corporations, particularly mining corporations, many of which are headquartered here in Canada. If you want to learn more about that, there's a great organization here, I think it's called Mining Watch, that does some good stuff on this. But again, you don't know about these internally displaced people. You don't know about the 6 million Colombians now living in Venezuela because they fled such violence. 6 million. We don't hear about that diaspora. We only hear about the diaspora going the other way. We don't hear about the 150 social leaders who've been killed in the past year in Colombia by state forces. 150. Union leaders, indigenous leaders, Afro-Colombian leaders, environmental leaders. And these murders have actually increased in recent years since the peace accords were signed. But these are unworthy victims I'm talking about. They're not worthy. Why? Because Colombia is the #1 ally of the U.S. in the Western Hemisphere. We give them more military aid than any country in the hemisphere. At one time, they were the third largest recipient of U.S. military aid on earth. And the U.S. has at least 7 military bases it operates out of Colombia. Meanwhile, strangely enough, Colombia is now a NATO partner. The only country outside of Canada and the US in this hemisphere that is a NATO partner. So it is not convenient to hear about these victims. We don't hear about their humanitarian crisis. We don't hear about the Wayu people who I visited in 2017 who live, actually they straddle both Colombia and Venezuela, but in Colombia, not far from the Venezuelan border, these folks live, they're the largest indigenous group in Colombia, and they are dying. No one disputes this. Their children are dying, they're starving, they have no water. And why? Because a mining company has dammed their river that used to feed their land. In fact, I stood in the river. They took me to the river, giant river. We stood right in the middle of it because there's no water in it. It's been dammed. These people need humanitarian help. But you won't hear about them. You're not going to push, no one's going to push the panic button about the Wayu people in Colombia. Because, again, there's Western mining companies who are the ones that are killing them. You're not going to hear about what's happening right now in the rainforest in Brazil by our good buddy, President Bolsonaro, who's one of the partners the U.S. is going to work with to try to overthrow the government in Venezuela. Bolsonaro was elected last year. And why? Or how? Because the most popular politician in Brazil, one of the most popular leaders in the world, in fact, Time magazine ranked him the #1 most influential person on earth, Lula da Silva, is rotting in jail. And yet Bolsonaro was democratically elected, even though his opposition opponent, who would have won with 80% of the vote, was rotting in jail with the help of the U.S. The U.S. Justice Department, as I mentioned in my book, by the way, worked intentionally with the Brazilian Justice Department to charge Lula da Silva, the former president, with bogus fraud claims and to put him in jail. The UN ordered Brazil to allow him to run for president last year, and they declined. And so now we have this right-wing thug, Bolsonaro, who's doing exactly what he promised to do. He is now invading the rainforests of Brazil, the lungs of the world, and he is attacking indigenous tribes in order to make the rainforest safe for international mining companies, many of which will come from the United States and Canada. And yet again, we won't worry about that humanitarian crisis. Nothing to see here. And so this is how the media system works, to make people go along with the next regime change, which is now happening in Venezuela. So let me talk a little bit about Venezuela specifically. As I mentioned, Hugo Chavez was elected president in 1998, inaugurated in 1999, so it's now 20 years, this January, that the Bolivarian Revolution, as he called it, began. And he was elected. I mention that because many times you'll read in the paper that he came to power through a coup. That's not true. He was elected president. So let's start there. And one of the first things he did was convene a constituent assembly to draft a new constitution. People from throughout the country participated in drafting it, and that constitution was put to a vote by referendum, and it was approved. They created a new constitution, which was important in a number of ways. First of all, it formalized the rights of Afro-Venezuelans, black Venezuelans, who had been invisible up to this time, and indigenous peoples in Venezuela. This was a huge step forward, and believe me, Afro-Venezuelans and indigenous Venezuelans are quite aware of what Chavez did for them. And in fact, let's be clear, the struggle between Chavez and Maduro and the opposition is both a class-based one, with the poor and working class supporting Chavez and now Maduro, and the wealthier opposing them. And it is also a racial struggle. The opposition has often resented the fact that Hugo Chavez, who they viewed as a black person, was their president, because that is not who they envisioned to be their president. And if you look at the people marching in support of the government and those marching against the government, those in the opposition tend to be whiter, wealthier, and those supporting the government are darker skinned and poorer. These are the types of people that most of us support, by the way. These are the types that most of us feel simpatico for. And yet, strangely, a lot of liberals and leftists are somehow not seeing that struggle for what it is. The other thing Chavez did, which people would be surprised to hear given the claims of Chavez and Maduro as being dictators and whatnot, is in the Constitution to formalize a more democratic system. So first of all, the Constitution allows for a recall. Hugo Chavez had to stand for recall election a number of times. Within a very short, I think during Chavez's tenure as president, either he, his party, or his policies had to stand for election 15 times. So very brisk democratic system. But the other thing he put in place is again, Jimmy Carter said, the best electoral system in the world. A uniform electoral system that everyone uses, that is nearly foolproof. And how it works, and I've seen it work about 6 times or so. I've been an election observer there about 6 times. It's done on a horseshoe. You go to the first bottom of the horseshoe and you have to present your fingerprint. You put it on a machine and the machine reads your fingerprint to make sure that you are an eligible voter and that you haven't already voted. And you also show picture ID. The machine doesn't even turn on unless you do these things. Once you turn it on by doing that, you then go to the top of the horseshoe and there's a box there, gives you a little privacy, an electronic voting machine where you vote. And once you vote, it prints out a paper receipt that you can then bring to the bottom of the horseshoe and put in a box which is sealed at the end of the voting day. That receipt shows, hopefully, and it invariably does, that the people you voted for electronically were the people who you did indeed vote for. So you can view, oh yeah, those are the right people. By the end of the night of election day, about 54% by law, again, by the Constitution, 54% of voting booths in voting locations are audited to make sure that those paper ballots match up with the electronic vote. It's incredible. It's a very elegant process. And then if people still aren't happy, they can call for a 100% audit, which I've also viewed. In 2013, there was nearly 100% audit of all votes cast because it was a very narrow election. And so this idea that somehow Chavez and Maduro are anti-democratic and dictators, it to me is painful when really the Chavista revolution, the core of it was to democratize Venezuela. And what about the nature of the opposition in terms of their commitment to democracy? Well, we know what it is because we got a little taste of it for a couple days in 2002 when the U.S. supported a coup against Chavez. He was kidnapped by parts of the military. He was taken to an island. And the opposition, the head of the Chamber of Commerce, declared himself president, as this guy Guaido has declared himself president. And they immediately destroyed every democratic institution. And you can see there's a great film called The Revolution Will Not Be Televised that shows all of this. So on camera, the new president says, this Constitution is gone. The Supreme Court is disbanded. The National Assembly is disbanded. And he fired the Attorney General the first day of the coup. And the U.S., of course, is one of the few countries in the world that recognized this coup government very happily. This was democracy opposition style, to summarily get rid of every democratic institution in the first 24 hours. Well, the coup was successful for about not even 3 days. Because what happened, and again, as this movie I mentioned shows in a quite dramatic fashion, people from the barrios, the poor from the barrios, came down from the mountains and they surrounded the presidential palace and they demanded that their president be returned. It's an incredible thing. And by the way, for those of you people of Christian faith, I'll just note that he was taken away on Good Friday of 2002 and he was resurrected on Easter Sunday. That is not lost on the Catholic. It is called The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, and it's a beautiful movie. And how it was filmed, there was an Irish film crew there just to film, what was happening with Chavez and different things. They were in the presidential palace when the coup happened, so they just kept filming, and so they caught all this on tape, and it's fascinating. But in any case, we see the nature so much of Chavez, who, by the way, returns as president and basically lets everyone off the hook. He was kidnapped, they think tortured, by the way, though he never talked about it. But apparently he was limping when he came off the helicopter. He didn't go out punishing the opposition who did this. He forgave most of them and sought reconciliation. I can tell you right now, if I kidnapped Donald Trump, I would be vaporized. I would not be here to talk about it. Probably if I did the same to Trudeau as well. But here, these people kidnapped the president, engaged in high treason, if there ever was such a thing, and they largely were freed to continue their oppositional activities to this day. And so we see the nature of the parties here in the 2002 coup, I believe. But again, we forget about that coup largely because, again, it's an inconvenient fact. So once Chavez dies in 2012 of cancer, an incredible thing happened. His vice president, Nicolas Maduro, stood for election. I don't know a lot about your system, but in my country, if the president dies, the vice president becomes president and serves out the rest of the term. That's how it goes. That's not true under the Venezuelan Constitution. Within, I think it was like 45 days of Chavez dying, and this was like, for some people, this is like their own father dying. I mean, it was, and I was there for this election, by the way. And people were just shell-shocked, that Chavez had died and how they have to frickin' organize an election and go to the polls. And they did. And it was a very highly contested election, and Maduro won, but by a very narrow margin, I think of just over 1%, and that's why the whole election ended up being audited. In 2018, he stood for election again. Again, I was an observer there. And 46% of the people voted. It was not a high turnout for Venezuelan standards. Not bad for U.S. standards, by the way, which has huge abstention. But the opposition, or segments of it, had called for a boycott of the election, and people did abstain. At the same time, there was a significant opposition candidate that did choose to run against Maduro, named Henry Falcone from the business community. By the way, Donald Trump tried to stop him from running. He threatened Falcone with sanctions if he ran for president, because the goal of Trump was, and the goal of the U.S. has been and is, not just about getting their person elected. It's about destroying the Bolivarian process, the system, the Constitution. And so they wanted to utterly delegitimize the election. But Falcone did go forward. 46% of the people voted. And about 67 to 68% who voted for Maduro. This is the man who they are saying was elected in a sham election. Meanwhile, the most prominent person saying that he was elected in a sham election and should be removed was Donald Trump, who is now president, even though he lost the election by nearly 3 million votes. But that's the system that I live in the United States, the democratic system. You can lose the election and win. And yet he is saying a guy who won with 67% of the vote is not properly the president. And so now the U.S. and Canada and a number of other rogue countries, I would say, are, despite the United Nations, which says Maduro's the proper president of Venezuela, have recognized a guy who never ran for president as president. And he didn't come up with the idea, this Guaido. We know that the vice president of the U.S. urged him to do this and was told he'd be recognized, and that's exactly what happened. Meanwhile, as the self-proclaimed president, the guy who never ran for president, much less did anyone cast even one vote for him, he's decided to start acting as president, and he purported to fire the board of Citgo, Venezuela's oil company, and replace it with an entirely new board. Every board director he named lives in the United States. And John Bolton, one of the architects, of course, of this coup, has made it clear that this is about oil. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves on earth, and John Bolton says he already has plans for American companies to take charge of the oil once we get our man in power. This is highway robbery. This is old-fashioned stick-up that's happening. Yeah, and yet so many people think this is a humanitarian operation. Meanwhile, are there problems in Venezuela? Sure, there are economic problems. There's no question about that. But why are there economic problems? And as Alfred de Zayas, the UN expert who went to Venezuela to study this problem, he concluded, and I agree with him, largely these problems are due to the sanctions that the U.S. has imposed against Venezuela. Not just sanctions, but in 2014, and again, this is not a controversial statement, this has been documented, I've seen a number of stories on it, including in the Independent of London, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia in 2014 made the conscious decision to flood the market with oil so that oil prices would plummet, and they did. Now the goal apparently mostly was to hurt Russia and Iran, but as again the Independent of London noted, this devastated Venezuela, which gets over 75% of all of its revenue from oil. And the prices dropped something like overnight from something like $120 a barrel to I think a low of $25 a barrel. Can you imagine? So all of the efforts that Chavez had made for years to lower poverty, to build social programs for the poor, were greatly decimated. Not entirely, though. Since that time, the government has continued to build homes for the poor. So far, they've built 2.5 million subsidized homes for the poor. 2.5 million in a country of 30 million. Think about it. So 2.5 million, let's assume an average family of four. 4 times 2.5 is 10. That's 10 million people out of 30 million who now have homes when they didn't. And this is one of the reasons. The other thing the government has done, because of food shortages, which, by the way, have been largely manufactured by the private sector, they're providing subsidized food to people who need it. And they have this CLAP program in which what they've done is encourage local farmers to grow food for local consumption, and they provide subsidized food through this program. Actually, The Guardian, in a moment of candor, about a few days ago, actually had a story how the CLAP program has now moved to the bakeries, and they now are providing baked goods through the same process. So the government has tried to lighten the blow of all these things, but it's been very difficult. Because of the sanctions, companies have, either because they're afraid to be sanctioned themselves for doing business for Venezuela, or because they themselves want to target Venezuela and undermine the government, have refused to sell to Venezuela, or they've agreed to sell, they just didn't deliver the product. They were happy to take the money from Venezuela for food, for insulin, for chemo medicine for children. They just didn't deliver it. And a number of companies have just left Venezuela. Kimberly-Clark was one, which makes, of course, paper products like toilet paper. You hear about toilet paper shortages and whatnot. Well, the company just left. Kellogg's left. It's very hard to fly there now. The only U.S. company that flies there is American. United and Delta used to go there. They don't go there, and American only has one flight. In fact, I'm going back in March. I have to fly to Miami at night, stay overnight, and fly in the morning, because there's only one morning flight every day. And again, so there's been this just international boycott of Venezuela. When I was there for one election, we had an international delegation of observers, and most of the Europeans had flown to Caracas directly from Paris on Air France. Within a day of landing, Air France said, we're not going to service Venezuela anymore. So they had no way home. And they didn't have U.S. transit visas because they didn't fly through the U.S. So they had to find some circuitous way through Panama or whatever to get back. But this is the type of economic warfare that Venezuela is experiencing. Meanwhile, Trump has said that he's going to sanction Citgo Oil, Venezuela's oil company in the U.S. Again, they're going to be, Trump says, fine, you're welcome to sell us oil, but none of the revenue will be allowed to be sent back to Venezuela. Meanwhile, the Bank of England has $1.5 billion in gold reserves that Venezuela deposited there. Venezuela asked for it back, and they said no. It'd be like you putting money in the bank, your savings, and the bank just said, we're not giving you your money. We have it, but we're not going to give it back. And so, while certainly the government of Venezuela has not always made the right moves to deal with these problems, to deal with the inflation created by these problems, you know, I always say to criticize that or to focus on that would be like telling a domestic abuse victim, criticizing her or him for not doing a good enough job defending themselves against their abusive partner. Instead of saying, hey, abusive partner, stop abusing that person, right? No one would ever think to say such things. But that is the level of discourse we have about Venezuela, that they could have done better. So right now, what are we facing? On February 23rd, and there are protests around the area about this, there's going to be this humanitarian aid that's going to be sent to Venezuela from the U.S. and Canada. By the way, the Red Cross has denounced this, saying it's not humanitarian, that it's political, and a number of humanitarian groups will not be a part of this for that reason. And I know that Canada plans on sending like $50 million or so in aid. But meanwhile, the sanctions have cost the Venezuelan government $20 billion just last year alone. You cost the country $20 billion in a year and you give them $50 million and think you're doing good for people? Of course, it's a joke. In fact, it's obscene. But people are fooled by it. Meanwhile, according to some, including Cuban intelligence, U.S. special forces have been landing in the Caribbean, possibly in preparation for this day when they bring in more than humanitarian aid in some sort of Trojan horse type operation. And so as you can see, it's a very dangerous situation we're facing. Meanwhile, the coup on its own has failed in Venezuela. It's going nowhere. Over 80% of the Venezuelans polled said, one, they reject the intervention in Venezuela, and over 80% polled said they oppose sanctions. And by the way, over 80% of Venezuelans said they didn't even know who Guaido is. And this is the guy who's going to restore democracy in Venezuela. So in any case, I want to close my remarks in chief to say that I think as dire as the situation is and seems to be, we have a great opportunity, you and I, as Canadians, as U.S. citizens, to stop the next regime change, the next disastrous intervention. And let me be clear, every intervention is a disaster. I'll leave you with the words of Eduardo Galeano, the great Uruguayan writer who died recently, wrote the book, The Open Veins of Latin America, said as every time the U.S. saves, and he put saves in quotes, a people, he leaves the place, it leaves the place either as an insane asylum or a cemetery. And we see this time again. And again, the idea that people seem to believe that the 82nd Airborne or the Canadian Royal Air Force, that those are human rights organizations, is the most bizarre idea that I've ever heard. And I think the only way we can stop this continued process of war and intervention is to get people to realize the basic truth that our militaries are not carrying human rights and democracy in their knapsacks. Thank you.